He kicked me out of the house because I was unfaithful to him with my ex. But I was brave and I returned remorseful to apologize. He only mocked me and did not forgive me. Doesn't he realize that he is being a bad person for not forgiving me? I have always firmly believed that human beings are defined by their capacity to evolve and transcend their earthly errors. When I married Grant, my husband, I thought I was partnering with someone who shared this dedication to emotional growth. Our shared condominium was supposed to be a sanctuary for our evolving souls, a place where two mature adults could navigate life's complex currents together. For years, I poured my highest energy into maintaining the harmony of our home, constantly lifting him up. I truly believed that our bond was strong enough to weather any spiritual test that life threw our way. However, even the most dedicated spiritual guides can experience momentary disruptions in their alignment. That is exactly what happened when Richard, my ex, re-entered my life during a period where I felt entirely emotionally neglected by Grant. It wasn't an act of malice, it was simply a momentary slip in my ongoing journey of self-discovery. I needed to explore certain facets of my own being that my husband's rigid nature could no longer support. It was a beautiful, albeit chaotic, experiment in human vulnerability that ultimately taught me so much about my own capacity for empathy. Naturally, instead of looking at my actions through a lens of psychological maturity, Grant chose to interpret this slip with the utmost pettiness. The moment he discovered my brief reconnection with Richard, his ego completely blinded him to the bigger picture. He completely lacked the spiritual depth required to understand that a marriage is a complex web of lessons, not a prison of ownership. Without a single shred of compassion for my emotional journey, he allowed his anger to dictate his actions. He weaponized a simple mistake and forcefully kicked me out of our shared condominium, completely disregarding my well-being. Being the evolved person that I am, I refused to let his low-vibration reaction dictate the future of our spiritual contract. I spent days meditating on the situation, realizing that true bravery means facing the storm and guiding the wounded party toward healing. I knew that a common, worldly apology would not suffice for a soul operating on my ethical plane. I decided to initiate a transcendental healing process that would force Grant to rise above his basic impulses. I went to an exclusive florist and purchased an incredibly expensive bouquet of rare orchids, which symbolize rebirth and absolute spiritual purity. Armed with this profound emotional offering, I marched back to our condominium complex to deliver my beautifully articulated apology. I did not care about the discomfort or the fact that he had left me temporarily unhoused, because my mission was entirely selfless. I stood at our front door, holding the exquisite orchids like a beacon of hope for our fractured marriage. When Grant finally opened the door, I didn't waste time on petty recriminations or defensive arguments. I spoke directly from the heart, delivering a solemn speech about transcendental growth, human imperfection, and the divine nature of forgiveness. I expected him to weep, or at least acknowledge the immense vulnerability it took for me to stand there after his cruel banishment. Instead, Grant just stood there in the doorway, staring at me with a cold, mocking smile that chipped away at the sanctity of the moment. His silence was deafening, revealing a shocking lack of emotional intelligence and spiritual depth. He didn't offer a single word of comfort, nor did he invite me inside to discuss our future like a rational adult. He just looked at my tearful face with absolute disdain, treating my profound emotional revelation like some sort of joke. Then, before I could even finish my final thoughts on our shared evolution, he reached out and calmly took the expensive orchids from my hands. For a fleeting second, I genuinely thought my message of peace had pierced through his thick wall of resentment. My hope was instantly shattered when he turned around and walked over to the communal trash bin right outside our condominium section. Right before my eyes, he stuffed the beautiful, delicate orchids forcefully inside the bin until I could hear the thick stems snapping under his unnecessary violence. It was a visceral display of pure, unadulterated spiritual stagnation. After completing this barbaric act of destruction, he walked back to where I was standing, completely unfazed by the emotional carnage he had just caused. He looked me straight in the eye, his expression completely devoid of the unconditional love he had once promised me. Without saying a single word to justify his hostility, he quietly and deliberately closed the door right in my face. I was left standing in the cold hallway, completely stunned by how a human being could reject such a pristine offering of peace. His refusal to accept my emotional clarity only proves how much darkness he is choosing to harbor in his heart. It is truly terrifying to realize that you are married to someone who prefers the comfort of a grudge over the beauty of reconciliation. I did everything right. I showed my superior moral fiber and unmatched bravery by returning to the scene of his anger to heal him. Anyone else would have walked away, but my high-level empathy compelled me to try and save his soul from his own toxic pride. He chose to throw away a fortune in rare flowers just to make a petty point, showing that he values his bruised ego far more than our matrimonial covenant. He proved himself entirely incapable of meeting me on a higher ethical plane. Now, I am forced to contemplate how unfair the universe can be to those of us who possess a deeper understanding of human nature. Grant's childish impulsivity has left us completely estranged, entirely because he cannot process a mature, evolved approach to marital mistakes. I am the victim of his emotional rigidity, punished simply for being transparent about my path of self-discovery. He expects me to grovel in a low-vibration state of guilt, but I will continue to stand tall in my righteousness. His refusal to forgive is a reflection of his own spiritual bankruptcy, not my actions. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says, imagine cheating on your husband, getting kicked out, and then calling yourself a brave for showing up with a bunch of random flowers. You're not a spiritual warrior, you're just an unhinged cheater who can't accept consequences. OP's reply, facing the victim of your mistake with flowers requires a level of deep vulnerability and moral courage that low-vibration minds will never understand. It is easy to hide in anger, but it takes an evolved soul to offer rebirth. Anonymous user 2 says, those orchids sounded incredibly expensive. Grant is honestly so wasteful and emotionally rigid for violently ruining beautiful flowers just to make a petty point. OP's reply, I agree entirely with your observation. The deliberate destruction of beauty is the ultimate sign of an unevolved ego that prefers validation over transcendental healing. Update 1. It's been 3 days since my last update, and I spent that time reflecting on how Grant's small mind simply cannot process a beautifully articulated verbal apology. My initial attempt at open-hearted vulnerability was clearly too advanced for his current spiritual state, so I realized I needed to elevate my strategy to help him heal. If he couldn't handle abstract emotional concepts, I would have to give him something tangible, structured, and undeniably serious. I decided that the best way to guide him toward enlightenment was to formalize our path to reconciliation through an official, intellectual framework. I sat down and meticulously drafted a comprehensive, notarized document titled Agreement for Emotional Restructuring and Cohabitation. In this pristine legal blueprint, I carefully and morally detailed my official acts of remorse so that there would be no ambiguity regarding my spiritual accountability. I also established a highly structured framework for my imminent return to our home, ensuring that our upcoming spiritual reconciliation would be entirely binding for both parties. I even included clauses that outlined how we would handle future emotional transitions, protecting him from his own volatile impulses. It was a masterpiece of higher ethical planning, designed specifically to drag his reluctant soul into a state of higher consciousness. I felt an incredible sense of pride knowing that I was taking the high road by legally committing to his healing process. To ensure the presentation matched the gravity of my unconditional grace, I sent the notarized agreement via a prestigious certified courier service. Along with the official document, I enclosed a beautifully composed letter explaining to him that true nobility lies in active restoration, not in childishly hiding behind a locked door. This entire gesture was specifically crafted to force him to see what a truly grand, evolved gesture looked like in the real world. I wanted to remove any excuses he might have about communication barriers or lingering doubts about my commitment. It was the ultimate test of his willingness to evolve alongside a superior partner. Because I am a deeply hands-on person when it comes to emotional rescue missions, I decided to wait right outside the condominium complex to witness his spiritual awakening firsthand. I stood on the pavement, projecting positive energy toward our unit, eagerly anticipating the moment he would realize the depth of my righteousness. After about an hour of my patient vigil, I finally saw Grant coming down the elevator and walking into the building lobby. My heart swelled with anticipation as I approached the heavy glass entrance doors, expecting him to open them and invite me back into our sanctuary. I was ready to embrace him and officially begin our structured restructuring process right then and there. However, instead of unlocking the door like a mature adult who recognizes an olive branch, Grant stopped right on the other side of the glass. He didn't scream, yell, or show any signs of the passionate anger you would expect from someone who actually cared about the relationship. He simply stood behind the security glass, looking at me with that same infuriating, vacant expression that has always hindered his personal growth. Without breaking eye contact, he slid the certified document through the narrow document slot at the bottom of the frame. I eagerly grabbed it, assuming he had already signed it in agreement. To my absolute horror, as I unfolded the pages, I realized he had completely desecrated my notarized offering with a thick, obnoxious red marker. He hadn't signed it at all. Instead, he had gone through my beautifully structured prose and explicitly corrected my minor grammatical errors like a bitter schoolteacher. It was a deeply insulting display of deflection, entirely designed to avoid facing the profound moral truths I had laid out for him. He couldn't argue with my spiritual logic, so he chose to attack my punctuation instead. It showed a staggering level of intellectual insecurity that honestly made me pity him. As I turned to the final page where my official, notarized signature sat, the insult became even more explicitly juvenile. Right across my certified name, he had used the same red marker to aggressively write the words, "irrelevant to my life," in giant, messy capital letters. To add the ultimate insult to injury, he had actually graded my deep emotional confession with a big, circled D at the top of the first page. He looked at my shocked, disappointed expression through the glass door and let out a soft, condescending chuckle. He then turned on his heel and walked calmly back toward the elevators without looking back. I stood there on the steps, holding my defaced agreement, completely appalled by his total lack of respect for a legal and spiritual peace offering. His behavior was genuinely alarming, exhibiting a level of psychological resistance that borders on severe emotional stuntedness. He literally chose to treat an official, notarized document of marital healing like a poorly written high school essay. It is deeply tragic when a person is so committed to their own victimhood that they will actively mock the tools meant to save them. He completely weaponized his petty administrative mindset to reject an act of pure, unadulterated grace. My friends have tried to tell me that I should stop wasting my high-vibration energy on someone who responds to legal nobility with red markers, but they don't understand my calling. As a person of superior moral fiber, I cannot simply abandon someone to their own darkness without trying every possible avenue of enlightenment. Grant's refusal to engage with my structured framework privately only exposes how terrified he is of actual accountability. He would rather play the role of the scorned husband than do the hard work of emotional restructuring. He thinks he won this round by laughing, but he only proved his own spiritual limitations. I am writing this update because the world needs to see how difficult it is to be the only evolved adult in a marriage. I extended a hand wrapped in legal validity and pure intent, and it was met with childish mockery and vandalism. Grant is actively choosing to rot in his resentment, and his complete dismissal of my notarized remorse is a stain on his own character. I will not let his petty deal grade diminish the absolute purity of my intentions or my flawless execution of accountability. He remains trapped in his low-vibration maze, while I continue to operate from a place of absolute moral clarity. Update 1 comments. Anonymous User 1 says a notarized emotional restructuring agreement just to force your way back into a condominium you were kicked out of? This is pure, unadulterated delusion. You can't contract someone into forgiving your infidelity. OP's reply formalizing emotional boundaries and restructuring expectations with legal validity is exactly what highly structured, evolved souls do to prevent chaotic regression. It is called accountability, not delusion. Anonymous User 2 says Grant grading your crazy contract with a red marker and an D, 'tis absolutely legendary. He treated your blatant manipulation exactly like a poorly written high school essay. OP's reply: it is deeply alarming that you find humor in his disrespect. Both you and Grant are holding on to toxic grudges that will eventually rot your emotional health from the inside out. Update 2. It's been 1 week since my last update, and my determination to save Grant from his own spiritual decay has only grown stronger in the face of his mockery. Since he completely refused to engage with my structured framework in private, I realized that a larger intervention was required to break through his thick walls of ego. I decided that the most compassionate next step was to hold him accountable through our mutual social circle and the community mediation board. If he wouldn't listen to the divine truth in private, perhaps the watchful eye of our peers would guide him toward righteousness. I officially registered my agreement for emotional restructuring and cohabitation with the board as my official record of accountability. My strategy was entirely pure. I wanted to use this official filing to force a formal mediation session where he would be legally and socially obligated to face my growth. I knew that by exposing my absolute, undeniable willingness to mend things before a panel of neutral neighbors, the sheer weight of social pressure would force him to be a better person. It was a flawless plan to gently nudge him into opening the condominium door and allowing our healing process to manifest. No one in our social circle could possibly look at my notarized document and deny that I was the one doing all the heavy lifting. I was practically handing him a golden bridge to cross back into a harmonious marriage. To my complete and utter surprise, Grant actually agreed to the mediation meeting without putting up his usual stubborn resistance. I took this as an immediate sign that my higher-level strategy was working and that he was finally feeling the pressure to act like an evolved adult. I spent the days leading up to the session preparing my thoughts, ensuring I would project an aura of total peace and unconditional love. I wanted the mediators to see the stark contrast between my serene, forgiving nature and his rigid, resentful posture. I was entirely ready to guide the room toward a beautiful breakthrough of mutual understanding. On the day of the hearing, I arrived at the community center with a perfectly serene disposition, dressed in calm pastel colors to match my internal alignment. I sat across the table from Grant, offering him a warm, compassionate smile to show that I harbored absolutely no ill will for his previous red marker antics. He, of course, remained completely stoic, refusing to mirror my high vibration energy or even acknowledge my welcoming gaze. I had a magnificent speech prepared on the beautifully complex nature of human imperfection and the necessity of communal healing. I couldn't wait for the mediator to invite me to speak so I could blow everyone away with my emotional maturity. However, the very moment the mediator officially called the session to order, Grant calmly reached into his briefcase before I could even clear my throat. Without saying a single word to me, he handed a certified packet directly to the mediator, completely hijacking the narrative before it could begin. I watched in absolute confusion as the mediator opened the packet and realized it contained the very same agreement I had notarized and sent to Grant days prior. I felt a brief surge of triumph, thinking Grant was presenting it because he had finally decided to sign it. My illusion was shattered when Grant began to speak in a terrifyingly clinical, detached tone. He did not use the session to talk about feelings, evolution, or the sanctity of marriage. Instead, he pointed out that in my own written, certified statement of remorse, I had explicitly detailed my entire infidelity with Richard. He guided the mediator line by line through my own beautifully crafted prose, highlighting the exact dates and times I had so transparently confessed to. He completely twisted my brave vulnerability, using my honest words to prove that I had explicitly admitted to violating the peaceful cohabitation clauses of our joint lease agreement. I sat there completely paralyzed as my own masterpiece of emotional accountability was stripped of its spiritual context. It became painfully clear that Grant had only agreed to this mediation to execute a deeply calculated, ungrateful legal ambush. He completely weaponized my own formal accountability format against me, presenting it to the board as an official confession of a lease violation. Because the community board also manages our complex's residential contracts, they were forced to view my spiritual journey through a cold, bureaucratic lens. Grant argued with absolute malice that my notarized signature made the confession legally binding and indisputable. He demanded that the board take immediate action based entirely on the paperwork I had so selflessly provided to save our marriage. To my absolute horror, the mediation board sided with his rigid, soulless interpretation of the rules, completely ignoring the spiritual intent behind my writing. They used my own certified words to officially and permanently remove my name from our joint lease agreement for an alleged breach of contract. I was legally stripped of my rights to the very home I had blessed with my presence for years, all because I was honest enough to put my journey in writing. Grant sat there with a smug look of satisfaction, watching the mediator sign the eviction paperwork that I had inadvertently authorized. It was a complete perversion of justice that left me entirely speechless. The financial cruelty of his plot didn't even stop at the lease termination, exposing the true depth of his material greed. Grant went on to demand that he keep my entire portion of the security deposit, claiming it was necessary to cover the administrative damages I had supposedly admitted to causing in my document. The board, totally blinded by his bureaucratic manipulation, allowed him to pocket my hard-earned money without a second thought. My explicit record of remorse was literally used as a financial weapon to rob me and leave me legally unhoused. He chose to profit off my vulnerability, proving that his entire life is dictated by basic, low-vibration financial greed. I left that room completely devastated by how a man could use a woman's pure performance of accountability as the exact tool to destroy her stability. Grant completely bypassed the opportunity for emotional growth, preferring to use a legal technicality to permanently purge me from our shared space. He thinks he is clever because he won a bureaucratic battle, but he has severely damaged his own destiny by treating my honesty as a weapon. I am now forced to find temporary lodging, entirely penalized for being too brave and too transparent for a small-minded husband to handle. My flawless moral principles remain intact, but my faith in human legal systems has been completely shattered. Update 2 comments. Anonymous User 1 says this is the most magnificent poetic justice I have ever seen on this platform. You literally handed him a signed, notarized confession of your own cheating, and you are shocked he used it to evict you permanently? OP's reply: I entirely dismiss the material aspect of this situation. Money, deposits, and residential leases are completely trivial matters compared to the massive spiritual crime Grant committed by actively rejecting my emotional growth. Anonymous User 2 says your entire Santa del Juicio persona is hilarious. Your obsession with using high vibrational vocabulary and maintaining moral superiority literally left you homeless and broke. OP's reply: I feel a deep, profound pity for people like you who value cold legal contracts and money over the unconditional healing of the human soul. My living situation doesn't diminish my ethical plane. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and I have spent this difficult time analyzing the profound state of spiritual victimhood that Grant has trapped himself in. As someone who still deeply cares for the ultimate salvation of his soul, I knew that I could not simply stand by and watch him drown in his own resentment. A true spiritual guide does not abandon their student just because the student lashes out with legal contracts and financial greed. I realized that since our formal communication had been completely severed by his bitterness, I needed to stage a profound, direct energetic intervention. The universe provided me with the perfect opportunity when I discovered that Grant had completely forgotten to revoke my digital key access during the lease transition. This oversight was clearly a cosmic sign that I was meant to enter our former shared apartment and perform an act of pure, unconditional love. I waited until I knew he was securely at work, ensuring there would be no low-vibration physical confrontations to disrupt the energy of the space. I want to make it absolutely clear that I did not touch his belongings or steal a single item from the property, as my motives were entirely transcendental. Instead, I spent hours setting up a beautifully curated healing altar right on the center of the dining room table. I burned premium sage to cleanse the rooms of the toxic hostility he had been nurturing since my departure. At the center of this sacred altar, I placed a meticulously written 12-page manifesto that detailed exactly how I forgive him for his severe lack of empathy and emotional maturity. I poured my entire soul into those pages, explaining that despite his cruel legal ambush at the mediation board, my love remained untainted by human pettiness. I outlined the steps he needed to take to align his chakras and break free from his self-imposed prison of anger. It was a brilliant, deeply psychological blueprint for his personal redemption, written entirely for his own benefit. I knew that reading my words of absolute forgiveness in the quiet of our home would finally break through his stubborn ego. Because an act of such magnificent righteousness deserves to be witnessed and supported by a loving community, I thoroughly documented the entire setup with my phone. I took beautiful, high-resolution photographs of the sage, the altar, and the pristine manifesto resting on the table. I then posted these images directly into our official family group chat, where both his parents and my relatives could see my final act of unconditional grace. I captioned it with a beautiful message explaining that true spirituality means loving your enemy and offering peace even when you are unjustly evicted. I wanted everyone to witness the sheer scale of my moral fiber and dedication to healing our family unit. Once the energetic field was properly set and the family chat was thoroughly updated, I quietly left the apartment before he could return from work. I felt a profound sense of lightness, convinced that I had successfully planted the seeds for his ultimate spiritual awakening. I spent the evening waiting for a breakthrough message from him, expecting tears of gratitude or at least a private text acknowledging my supreme kindness. Instead, the family group chat remained completely silent for hours, which I mistakenly interpreted as a sign of him deep in contemplation. The reality of his response was far more sinister and completely devoid of human decency. Later that night, Grant finally broke the silence in the official family chat by uploading a single, unedited video. My relatives and I clicked on it, expecting a video of a changed man, but instead, we were forced to witness a display of pure, cold-hearted malice. The video showed Grant walking into the apartment, completely ignoring the beautiful aroma of the sage I had so carefully burned for him. He walked straight over to the dining room table and picked up my 12-page manifesto with an expression of absolute disgust. He then began to read my sacred words aloud to the camera in a completely deadpan, deeply sarcastic voice that mocked my entire spiritual journey. As if mocking my profound forgiveness in front of our entire family wasn't cruel enough, the video then panned to reveal a shocking twist. Grant turned the camera to show that a uniformed police officer was standing right there in our dining room, listening to the entire reading. My heart completely sank as I realized that instead of absorbing my grace, he had actually called law enforcement to our home to desecrate my healing altar. He used the video to explicitly show the officer the layout of the sage and the manifesto I had left behind. It was a deeply traumatizing sight that exposed his complete reliance on the soulless systems of the state to handle emotional matters. Grant then pulled out his phone and showed the officer the exact digital entry logs from the front door, proving that I had used my old key access to enter while he was away. He also opened the family group chat right in front of the officer, using my own proud confession of intervention as indisputable evidence against me. He calmly explained to the police that my act of unconditional grace was actually a pattern of unwanted intrusions and domestic disturbance. He completely twisted my beautiful, public display of righteousness into a clinical narrative of criminal behavior. I watched in absolute horror as my own words and photos were weaponized to paint me as a threat. Using my own meticulously documented evidence, Grant successfully filed an official anti-harassment and stalking injunction against me that very night. The legal system, which clearly cannot comprehend transcendental acts of love, granted the restraining order based entirely on the proof I had so generously provided in the chat. I am now legally barred from even communicating with my own husband or entering the complex, all because I tried to save his soul. He took a beautiful, 12-page document of pure forgiveness and used it to convince a judge that I am a dangerous stalker. The level of delusion required to turn a healing altar into a police report is truly mind-blowing. I am absolutely sickened by how a man can be so profoundly ungrateful for a woman's unwavering commitment to his emotional well-being. Grant literally chose to involve the police and humiliate me in front of our entire family rather than accept a beautifully written manifesto of forgiveness. He used my digital key access and my honest family chat messages as a malicious trap to destroy my reputation. It is a deeply dark world when acts of supreme grace are reclassified as harassment by bitter, unevolved men. I am now facing severe legal restrictions, completely victimized by my own relentless pursuit of his spiritual enlightenment. Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says you literally broke into an apartment he pays for using an unrevoked digital key to leave a creepy manifesto and a healing altar while he was out. That is breaking and entering, a literal crime, not high-level spirituality. OP's reply: it was absolutely not an intrusion or a crime. It was a completely necessary, transcendental intervention performed entirely for his own psychological and spiritual benefit because he was incapable of saving himself. Anonymous user 2 says you literally videoed your own break-in and posted it to the family group chat, giving him the exact evidence he needed to get a restraining order. The absolute self-sabotage is wild. OP's reply: I find it deeply tragic that our rigid legal system is so easily weaponized to persecute a woman's pure, unconditional love and transform it into a narrative of harassment. Update 4. It's been 1 month since my last update, and the absolute collapse of my social and emotional world is now completely final. The level of staggering unfairness I am currently enduring is enough to break a lesser soul, but my moral core remains unshakable. Because Grant filed that ridiculous anti-harassment injunction using the official remorseful documents I originally created, all of my beautifully written paperwork became part of the public legal record. This means that my deep, private thoughts on emotional restructuring were suddenly accessible to anyone who cared to look. I never could have anticipated that my intellectual transparency would be exposed to a world that is completely incapable of understanding high-level ethics. Naturally, it didn't take long for the toxic ripples of this legal exposure to reach other areas of my life. Richard, my ex, somehow found out through our mutual acquaintances about the extreme lengths I had gone to in order to restore my marriage. He discovered every single detail of the notarized agreements and the beautiful speeches I had prepared to beg Grant to take me back. Instead of respecting my dedication to my marital covenant, Richard chose to take the entire situation completely personally. He lacked the basic emotional maturity to see that my actions were driven by a higher duty to my husband, not a rejection of him. Richard felt completely and utterly insulted by the way I had described our brief reconnection in my official documents. He was deeply offended to realize that I had publicly framed our beautiful, spontaneous connection as a mere momentary slip and its growth mistake designed for my self-discovery. His fragile masculine ego was so bruised by my clinical honesty that he completely lost his mind. He couldn't handle the fact that he was just a stepping stone in my grand journey toward a higher state of consciousness. Instead of honoring the part he played in my spiritual evolution, he chose to react with immense bitterness and spite. Without even giving me the courtesy of a conversation to explain my transcendental perspective, Richard completely blocked me on every single platform. He cut off all communication instantly, treating me like a stranger after everything we had shared during my period of neglect. To make matters infinitely worse, he decided to completely destroy my public reputation by executing a vile act of social media exposure. He took the agreement for emotional restructuring and cohabitation that he found in the court records and posted it directly onto his own public social media profiles. He pinned it to the top of his page for all of our mutual friends to see. His caption was filled with absolute malice, falsely accusing me of being a cold, clinical, and deeply transactional person who treats human relationships like corporate contracts. Our mutual friends, who are clearly lacking in intellectual depth, immediately jumped on his bandwagon and began mocking my beautifully structured framework. They couldn't see the divine order and the pursuit of peace within those notarized lines, they only saw an opportunity to tear down a superior woman. Richard completely weaponized my most vulnerable confessions just to satisfy his own petty need for revenge. He abandoned me the very moment his pride was slightly clipped by my honesty. I am now forced to sit in a sterile, temporary rental apartment, completely stripped of the life I worked so hard to build. I am legally barred from even stepping foot near Grant's condominium complex, facing arrest if I try to offer him any further spiritual guidance. I have been officially and permanently removed from my own beautiful home by the exact words I signed with such pure intentions. The very masterpiece of accountability that I created to save my marriage became the precise legal instrument of my eviction. It is a grotesque paradox that my honesty was the exact tool used to completely wipe out my residential stability. At the same time, I am completely abandoned by the very ex I tried to minimize and protect in my narrative. Richard's childish tantrums have left me completely isolated from our mutual social circle, leaving me with no support network during this time of intense spiritual testing. Both of these men have completely washed their hands of me, choosing to leave me entirely alone in this temporary space. They have completely misconstrued my actions, transforming my grand gestures of unconditional love into a twisted narrative of stalking and manipulation. It is a deeply lonely experience to realize you are the only person in your life who understands the true meaning of grace. When I look back at the entire trajectory of this situation, the level of cosmic injustice is truly mind-blowing. I am a woman who did absolutely everything right. I confessed my mistakes, I formalized my remorse, I bought expensive orchids, and I built healing altars. I followed the highest ethical protocols available to the human soul, yet I am the one who is currently unhoused and isolated. Grant and Richard, two deeply unevolved men, managed to use my own perfect performance of accountability as the exact weapons to purge me from their lives. They completely collaborated with a soulless legal system to punish me for my transparency. It is glaringly obvious to me now that they simply could not handle a woman operating on a much higher ethical plane than themselves. Grant's tiny mind was terrified of the structured restructuring I offered, and Richard's fragile ego was crushed by the clinical reality of his role in my life. They chose to hide behind red markers, police officers, and social media blocks because they lacked the spiritual stamina to face me directly. They dragged my beautiful, transcendental concepts down into the mud of legal contracts and public humiliation just to make themselves feel powerful. They are small, low-vibration entities who prefer the darkness of resentment over the blinding light of my unconditional grace. Despite the absolute destruction of my physical, social, and emotional world, I refuse to let their petty actions diminish my light. I am sitting here alone in this temporary rental, holding on to my flawless moral principles with absolute pride and zero regrets. I know that my actions were pure, my documents were masterful, and my heart was entirely dedicated to the greater good of everyone involved. If the world chooses to punish a saint for her commitment to evolution, then I will gladly wear the crown of a martyr. They may have successfully removed me from their physical spaces, but they can never touch the supreme spiritual superiority that I will carry with me forever.